Hi everyone, I want to continue going over Mark 11 and trying to explain why I believe this all has to do with DNA. But there's some interesting things that have come up in the meantime. Originally, when I set out to try to explain this chapter, I wasn't even thinking about the significance of Passover and how this was describing the events leading up to Passover. I just wanted to explain about the number 11 and what I believe is the theme very often in chapter 11 or verse 11, but it's not just chapter 11 or verse 11. I believe this is the theme of the entire Bible, but that's originally what I wanted to explain. But being that this is describing the events leading up to the Passover, and there's other information that's been coming out about Passover that I want to try to incorporate into this because I believe this is all connected. And one of the things I want to talk about is this video over here by Steve Fletcher, where he's talking about Amos 8 and how there seem to be clues in Amos 8 that seem to be pointing to the Passover. And in particular, I want to talk about this word right here. And this word actually in the Hebrew word means Passover. If you look it up over here, you'll see that it means Passover. And this is something that Steve Fletcher talked about in his video over here. But when I looked this word up in the Greek, I noticed that this word means crossing, which I thought was very interesting in light of what I've been talking about in Mark 11, where I've been talking about the crossroads that's being described in Mark 11. And this word right here actually means crossroads. It's a place where two roads cross. So it actually makes the image of a cross or the crucifixion. So it seems to be alluding to the crucifixion or the cross, but it's also alluding to the fact that there's a junction and a crossing or crossroads, which is what's described in Mark 11 as well. And like I've said before, and like I've been trying to explain, I believe this all has to do with DNA. And then there's also this video over here that was done by Bold Soldier. And in this video, and I'm leaving it over here because I think it's really interesting. Well, I'll just point that out first and then I'll back it up. But I think it's interesting that this came up on the Ten Commandments, which was the first Passover. It was the crossing of the Red Sea is what happened at the first Passover. I believe it was on the seventh day of Passover that they crossed the Red Sea. And this is not what Bold Soldier was talking about in this video. He was actually talking about a dream he had of Lecrae, and to be honest, I really don't even know who that is, but I think he's a rapper, from what I'm understanding. But he was talking about a dream that he had about him crossing over. And so I thought that was really interesting, and it got my attention because even though he wasn't talking about the Passover, he was talking about crossing over. And I believe that's what the Passover is all about. And it was foreshadowed by the crossing of the Red Sea, but ultimately it will be a crossing over, not just crossing into the Red Sea or crossing over the Red Sea. And so I wanted to talk a little more about that because I do believe there's some clues in Amos 8 that seem to be pointing to the Passover and that seem to be connected to what I've been talking about in Mark 11. But first I want to go back to Mark 11 and try to finish explaining how I believe the imagery that's being presented is that of DNA. And I had gone through to about verse 10 or 11 where Jesus had rode on a donkey, and I explained how the donkey represents the DNA, represents Christ's DNA being joined with the DNA of the bride of Christ. And the bride of Christ is represented by New Jerusalem, and I find it interesting that just after it describes Jesus riding in on a donkey and the palm branches being waved, and how they threw their garments and spread them across for him to go over. Then it talks about, then it says Jesus entered into Jerusalem, and of course the bride is New Jerusalem and into the temple, and New Jerusalem is synonymous with the temple. So I explained how I believe this is all explaining the restoration of the temple, and it's interesting that that comes up in verse 11. And then it goes on to say, and on the morrow when they were come from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing a fig tree afar off, having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And I just thought that was an interesting choice of words right here, because this is a form of the word perhaps, but in terms of DNA, I believe this could be referring to half, because I had talked about how the temple, Bethany is the, or actually Bethphage is the house of unripe figs that it mentioned in the beginning of the chapter. Over here, Bethphage means unripe figs, and then Bethany means the house of misery. And in terms of the temple, I had said how this half described would be the part that's the unripe figs or the misery. And in terms of DNA, this word happily could refer to the half of the DNA that would need to be restored. And I could talk a little more about that later when I go over this table over here that I did. There was actually a few tables that came up, but when you put in the word gamete, which is a reproductive cell, it actually comes up with 23 matches, and there's 23 chromosomes in a gamete cell because it's a haploid cell, so it has half the number of chromosomes as in a regular human cell, normal human cell. And the word haploid doesn't actually mean half, it means plain. And then the normal cell, which is diploid, which is 46 chromosomes, means double because it has 2 sets of chromosomes. But I just happened to notice this right here. It has this word right in the middle of the text. And like I said, this is referring to a reproductive cell. And as you can see over here, it comes from the word which means to marry in the Greek. And so the concept is that this is for the purpose of reproduction. And it's interesting that it has other words in the text here, and I'm just noticing this stuff as I'm going over this, but you see it has a word father over here, and then it has a word born over here, and then it has children over here. So it's interesting that all these terms come up where you have the word gamete. But the table that I want to go over, there's a couple of tables that come up with the word gamete that I thought were really interesting. This one has Yeshu and bride. And Yeshu is a name for Jesus, and I'll just show you that over here. You can see that here, and if you look in Wikipedia, you'll see that that's how Jesus' name is written in the Talmud, and it's pretty much how they say it in Israel in Hebrew. Okay, and so you see Yeshu comes up here in the pink, the letters Y, E, S, H, U, and then bride comes up straight up and down right in the middle of it. And then you have gamete coming right through that as well in the light red with the letters G, A, M, E, T, E. And you also have the word wed, and then you have the word born, and also tried putting in Passover and Pentecost, and all those terms came up. You can see pass here in the green, you can see over in the yellow, you can see wed over here in the bluish purple, you see born going right through over here where it has gamete and bride and Yeshu. You see born in the blue with the letters B, O, R, N. And then you see the first part of Pentecost in the green and the second part in the burgundy. And so the concept is that you have two gamete cells, each having 23 chromosomes. And of course Satan tries to imitate this. That's why he had the twin towers. And they each represent 23 chromosomes, and then the two coming together represents the two DNA strands intertwined, which is represented by the Freedom Tower. And that's why Bush read Psalm 23, but then Obama read Psalm 46 at the 9/11 memorial site. And I was trying to find this video because this was coming up in my homepage so I could show this picture. And so I had put this in over here, but I just noticed this was in the I Pet Goat as well. They had put in Psalm 23 in the I Pet Goat movie. So Satan tries to imitate this, but this is the true restoration of the temple. And so this is why Jesus destroyed the fig tree. It was because it was not producing any fruit. And so this is the half that needs to be cast out, that needs to be restored and replaced with the true DNA, the DNA of Christ. And this was after 4 years or 3.5 years. So this was Christ letting them know that time was up, and so that's why he cursed the fig tree. And I can talk more about that later, but then the next thing that happened is when Jesus cleansed the temple and when he overthrew the tables, and this is an important word right here, which I can talk more about, but this is a parallel to what's written in John 2, and this is what Steve Fletcher had talked about when Jesus cleansed the temple in John 2. But as you can see here, when they asked Jesus why he was doing this, Jesus answered and said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. And then the Jews said, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. And so there's 46 chromosomes in a human body, and it took 46 years to build the temple. And as Jonathan Kleck has explained in his videos, it took 23 years to build the first temple, but then it took 46 years to build the second temple. And so Satan tries to imitate everything God does, but ultimately this is the imagery that God is giving for the restoration of the temple, and he's likening it to the 46 chromosomes in a human body. And I'm about out of time, so I have to continue in the next video. Thank you.